When people understand the what and the why, they assign meaning to what they're doing, and they switch on their prefrontal cortex. That executive function in the brain actually dampens down the circuits that has nothing to do with anything else but that single-minded thought.
We're often not very vulnerable at work, so you can't rely on the same template you had when you were a kid now as an adult. Otherwise, according to the research, if you think it happens just based on luck, you're more likely to be lonely 5 years later.
There's a piece of relational trauma. We call that complex PTSD.
There's some visual things like just looking at ourselves in the mirror. And we all have optimistic bias. So I encourage everyone to look in the mirror.
The gut actually signals to the brain what we should be feeling at any particular moment. It produces serotonin, it produces dopamine. I mean, these are the things that we think about are produced only in our brain, but actually 90% of it is produced in our gut.
What are you working on right now, though, that you're most excited about? Because when we were getting ready to do this, you're like, I am probably more excited right now than I ever have been in my life. So let's start there.
Yeah. What's happened in the last 2 years, we run these week-long events, and it's a full immersion. And just before COVID, we had a group of scientists from the University of California, San Diego, come and study some of the phenomenological things that have been happening in people's biology, because we have had numerous testimonies of some of the most incredible things that if you asked me 3 years ago when I was first on your show, would we ever see anything like this, or do you think you'd see anything like this? I'd probably say maybe once in my lifetime I'd be super happy. So blind people seeing, deaf people hearing, people in wheelchairs that from strokes with paralysis walking again. I mean, these are profound upgrades biologically. I think if you teach people the what and the why, then the how gets easier because it becomes practical. And when people understand the what and the why, they assign meaning to what they're doing, and they switch on their prefrontal cortex. That executive function in the brain actually dampens down the circuits that has nothing to do with anything else but that single-minded thought, right? So when you understand the what and the why, and there's nothing left to conjecture, to superstition, to dogma, to spirituality, that science is the contemporary language that we use to demystify the mystical. So when that person stands on the stage and they're telling their story and they're the example of truth, they're speaking truth, right? So they've actually applied those principles that were once philosophical, theoretical, that was just basically knowledge, and the application, the personalization, the demonstration created an experience. Experience is really what changes us because it enriches the circuitry in the brain, but the end product of an experience is an emotion, right? And emotion is what teaches our body chemically to understand what our mind intellectually understood. I look out in the audience and people are leaning in. You know, they're looking at truth. They're looking at an example of truth. That is the 4-minute mile. That's somebody who broke through a level of consciousness or unconsciousness that says that we can heal by thought alone. So what is the science behind that? So when we started bringing in reputable scientists, people that are well published, that spend their life studying microbiology and cellular function and epigenetics and brainwave function and all these other different elements, thousands of metabolites on a cellular level that could be secreted. We're looking very specifically when we did these studies. So we started studying everything. And we started looking at brains, and we started looking at hearts, and then we started noticing that people would have these very, very, very transcendental moments where there was a significant arousal that took place in their brain. And that arousal, which is typically based in fear, in anger or aggression or in pain, that's a survival response. This arousal was ecstasy. This arousal was bliss. So the amount of energy in those people's brains during that moment of and the only way that I could describe it is connection. That moment produced such a level of energy in the brain that it was hundreds of times normal.
And this is being measured. You're doing the brain scans.
We're measuring it in real time.
Right, exactly.
And then when we see these very, very high degrees of energy in the brain at the same time, we're seeing a high level of order. Now, not just a little order, not a lot of order, like a supernatural amount of order.
When you say order, Joe, do you mean the coherence between the brain and the heart, or what do you mean by order when you say that?
Okay, so if you're late for an appointment, you got to pick your kid up. There's 10 texts you have to answer, and something went wrong at the office. The arousal of the stress hormones causes us to move into that primitive nervous system of survival. And when we're in stress, we're trying to control, we're trying to predict, we're trying to organize our life because that unknown is something can go wrong. It's unpredictable. So we shift our attention to one person, to another meeting, to another place we have to go, another time, another thing we have to do. And every single one of those elements has a neurological network in our brain because you've experienced your wife, you've experienced your coworker, you experienced your pain in your back, your cell phone, whatever. You have a relationship with everything physical or material. And it's mapped neurologically in the brain. In fact, the neocortex is really a record of the past, right? So the arousal of those stress hormones causes us to shift our attention to all of these different elements, and we activate those circuits. And like a lightning storm in the clouds, the brain starts firing very incoherently. And when the brain is incoherent, we're incoherent. And when the brain isn't working right, we're not working right. At the same exact time, you're sitting in traffic. You can't really run. There's nowhere to run. You can't really fight. There's no one to fight. And, you can't really hide. And so the arousal of this primitive nervous system causes the heart, its rate to increase and a respiratory rate to increase because that was the mechanism of survival. If you're being chased by T-Rex, you better increase your heart rate and your respiratory rate. So now the heart rate and the respiratory rate are increasing, but you're not running, fighting, and hiding. There's a physiological change in your body for emergency.
Yeah.
And you're taking all this vital energy that you would use for growth and repair, for long-term building projects, and you're tapping all the body's resources, and you're turning it and converting it into chemistry, right? So now the heart is racing, but you're not using that energy, so it's pumping against a closed system, and it causes the heart to start firing very incoherently, and that's when you stop trusting. That's when you stop loving. That's when you stop communing. That's when you stop cooperating. That's when you stop really creating or thinking about possibilities. Not a time to learn, not a time to go within. And so people spend the majority of their time living in the state. And in that aroused state, those chemicals heighten our senses. And we narrow our focus on the material world because that's where the danger is. If something's behind the big rock and you hear it moving and it's dark at night and you're walking, you're going to freeze and you're going to narrow your focus, and the arousal is going to heighten your senses. And that kind of narrow focus becomes habituated when people live in constant stress. Now, we talked about this on one of the shows we were on, and you can turn on that response just by thinking about your problems. So now the arousal of those chemicals becomes almost like an addiction. It's
the familiar,
and you need the familiar stimulation to reaffirm that emotional state, right? Because that's how we feel alive. So we thought, wow, what if we teach people how to go from that narrow focus to broadening their focus and opening their focus and focusing on nothing material or physical. And when we did that, by sensing space, by sensing nothing, opening and broadening their focus, those different compartments of the brain that were firing out of order incoherently started to synchronize.
Got it.
Now, what syncs in the brain links in the brain. And all of a sudden, the person starts to feel more like themselves. There's an integration. So we started noticing these elegant states where there was global coherence. In other words, we were measuring many compartments of the brain simultaneously. And when waves are working in order, when they're working in coherence, then the whole entire brain is working like a symphony. And you start feeling whole, and you start feeling clear, and you can think, you're coherent, you can have a vision or an intention of the future.
I was reading a survey the other day that said about 24% of people report some form of mental illness or strife in their life.
Yeah.
Why do you think such a high percentage of people during such an interesting time in our culture are so unhappy? What do you think it is?
There's so many factors going on, really, from my perspective. I mean, clearly one of them is a pandemic. I mean, it has really got people in a place that they never thought they would be, and particularly the ongoing nature of it. You know, I've been studying the neurobiology of trauma, PTSD, and dissociation for a really long time. But this is an ongoing thing, and it's going on and on and on. And, you know, we've been through so many different waves of this so far, and people get really burned out. It's called adrenal fatigue. Your systems can't maintain it anymore. Our cortisol levels cannot sustain up, down. Oh, a vaccine. Oh, there's not. Another variant. Keep going. Don't go. Like, it's just too much for our systems. So it's wearing on everyone. And so there's that piece, right? And then there's the general world pre-pandemic. I mean, there's a lot of difficulties in the world, and people are struggling. And, you know, 20% of the population is depressed at any one time outside of a pandemic.
This term PTSD. So, you know, I do a lot of reading about this stuff, and I had an interesting upbringing. When I say interesting, there was some trauma there for sure.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people listening to this or watching it wonder, when I think of PTSD as a layman, first thing I think of is soldiers, combat, right? That's the first thing I think most people think of.
Yeah.
And then I think, you know, maybe some super dramatic issue that happens in one's childhood. But how would you define PTSD? How broad is there a spectrum of it? And how would you describe it?
Totally. Yeah, that's a great question, Ed. And it is a spectrum. I think trauma is a spectrum disorder. One of the things I say in my book is everyone has some kind of overwhelming life experience. Nobody gets away free of that. Okay. So, and people don't like this word trauma so much in the general public. They don't like the word PTSD. Oh, that's not me. Right. So I do really define trauma on a spectrum. It's an overwhelming life experience. And often it has to do with the perception of the person experiencing it. Right. You can be bullied on the playground at school and be like, whatever, no big deal. And somebody else, you know, your friend sitting next to you is bullied on the playground and has a horribly difficult experience with it, right? So it depends on the nature and the event of what happens. And it also depends on how the individual perceives it. You know, we're talking about single incident car accident, death of a loved one, being shamed. Like, who in the world hasn't been shamed at one point in their life, right? To ongoing, this piece, I don't know if you're aware of this, Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey wrote this book recently, and it has a lot to do with ongoing relational trauma. Okay, so there's a piece of relational trauma. We call that complex PTSD, right? And that's where most family dysfunction comes in. Right? When you're relationally, you know, there's, whether it's drinking, yelling, screaming, neglect, there's a lot of stuff that happens in families that is considered dysfunctional and traumatic, and it has an effect on people, you know, which is different than that whole other spectrum where people are kidnapped and beaten and raped. That's one extreme. So I really do see trauma on a spectrum, and nobody's free of it.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. I'm so glad you said it that way, because I think a lot of people maybe discount things that have happened. These emotions are installed in our neurochemistry when we're young, when certain things happen, or when we're older. And it's a weird analogy, but I want in a minute, guys, we're going to talk about how do you overcome these things, right? The weird thing I want to share with you, I just was thinking about in preparing for this, as I was preparing to be with you, I have two little Pomeranians. And one of them's this joyous Pomeranian, little Lily's her name, and she's been with us all her life. She's had a pretty blissful, you know, lifetime. My other one, Daisy, we took from someone, and our groomer asked us to take her, and she had been left in cars and had neglect and all these other things. And there's these associations she makes with different things where she'll just, like yesterday, we won't take her for a walk. Any walking outside the house, she just begins to shake and tremble. And so there's this connection she's made with certain circumstances, places, and things like anchors or triggers almost.
You got it.
That I think that humans have these anchors and triggers. Many times we're unaware of them. So can you take us through what happens to us when trauma happens, some type of trauma? And what is an anchor and or a trigger, or what I'm at least using my own terminology for that? Yeah,
that's exactly right. No, you're doing a great job, honestly. You've done your homework. Let me say that, Ed, because it's true. So anytime anyone has an overwhelming experience, it's stored in their body, okay? And it can be stored in any number of ways. You can store it emotionally, you can store it physically in your body, and you can store it in thoughts and beliefs. So anytime we go through something overwhelming, it's stored inside. And then what ends up happening, Ed, is that we have this series of ways to try to protect ourselves. It's the normal response. So in the work that I do, which is called internal family systems, you develop protective parts of yourself that try to protect you from your overwhelming experiences. Most people, and we'll call them defenses, but they're protections, okay? That you protect yourself from your pain. And so what ends up happening, if you have an overwhelming experience in childhood, college, whatever, it's still stored. You think it's gone, but it's not. So anytime it gets triggered, if you get yelled at as an adult by your boss, it triggers those wounds that are still in there. And then your protectors jump in. You yell, you scream, you drink, you do whatever. So our protectors show up once our wounds get triggered. Okay. And this is what happens for people. People come into therapy, Ed, they don't say, hey, I want to work on the fact that I was unloved by my mother or father. Like, that's not what people come into therapy. Right. They're like, I'm having trouble with my kids. I'm getting in trouble at work. I'm unhappy. This is my third relationship. Like, those are the protective parts that are not doing so well in somebody's life, but they're really rooted in their trauma, right?
She became a New York Times bestselling author.
Yes.
The rest of your life, when you walk in a room, it's no longer Dr. Marisa Franco. It's New York Times bestselling author, Dr. Marisa Franco. We really almost overemphasize romantic love relationships, and we sort of minimize platonic love relationships, almost as if they should be or must be secondary. So talk about the history of that, because that fascinated me. And why is it that you think it's that way? And is that actually true?
Yeah. So in the past, it wasn't always this way. We got married, not for love, but for resources in like the early 1800s and before.
Right.
And so love wasn't a part of marriage. And in fact, people really looked for feelings of romance. And how I define romance here is, you're excited about someone, you're thrilled to see them, you yearn for them, you idealize them. There's a deep level of intimacy and passion. People found that in their friendships because at that time, interactions among people of the same gender were considered a lot more intimate, and the genders were considered to be too distinct for people to form these sort of deep connections. And so because of that, people really experience all types of intimacy in their friendships that we experience far less today. Like, friends were able to hold hands with each other, share beds, write love letters to each other. That all changed because around 1867, society really changed in the Western world, changed how they viewed homophobia. So before then, it was sort of taboo to have same-sex love, but it wasn't taboo to engage in all of these behaviors that weren't actually sexual. Like I said, holding hands, sharing a bed, writing love letters, right? But then two psychiatrists, Sigmund Freud, Richard von Krafft-Ebing, they basically wanted to make it even more taboo for same-sex love to happen as people were moving into cities and there's an increase in these same-sex sexual acts. So they sort of created these theories that same-sex sexual love is a disorder that defines someone's entire identity. So now it wasn't just the sex that was stigmatized. It was the entire gamut of behaviors that could perhaps suggest sexual interest. And so after that, people felt like if I express love to my friends too deeply, I might come off as being in love with them.
Yeah, and that's
And
so
so
much. It's really part of our culture now, isn't it? I mean, I didn't mean to jump in there, but first off, I didn't know the history. So, and I started to read, and I'm like, actually, it's accurate that a couple centuries ago that most people did not marry necessarily for love. Some did, but a lot of people married because it was arranged by their families, or they were in the same caste system, or there was a financial reason to do it. And it fascinated me to think that prior to that, because what is natural? I think a lot of people listening to this would say, I actually am so comfortable loving my friends. It's easier. It feels like it should be that way. I think when I hear something, I kind of put it through do I agree with that life meter? I'm 51 years old, right? And I'm a unique male in the fact that I tell most of my male friends, hey man, I love you. I feel like I have pretty intimate relationships with my male friends, and that I do tell them I love them. I have this thing that I do with my friends often. You might get a kick out of this, where I'll say, you know what, man? Let me tell you about you. And then I pour into them. Man, how special you are, how smart you are, how much I love you. And I can't wait to see these male friends of mine. Yet, I do sense, particularly with men, but I guess it's true with both genders, but I do sense that, to an extent. And then this is getting a little weird, right? And that little weird is a cultural change. There isn't anything weird. I don't have any physical attraction to any of my male friends. It's an intimate relationship that's non-physical. Yet we've conflated these things now. And I actually wept listening to this story that I'd like you to share with my audience about the letter that you wrote for your friend that you
Yeah.
decided not to send her, and why just something about our conditioning caused you to think that maybe you were stepping too far. And I will agree with this linkage that somehow there's a homophobic tendency linked to it that changed in our culture. And I don't even know that it necessarily matters for everyone to agree with the reason, but you should ask yourself whether or not it's accurate. It's 100% accurate. That getting too close to our friends who might be of the same sex is somehow some taboo thing. So would you talk about that letter? Because I don't think people will forget this.
Yeah, so it was for my best friend Kana, who lives on the other side of the country. And I was writing her a letter, and it said, I feel like you're my soulmate, and I've known you many lives before. And I felt shame. I just felt like, I don't know, like, I guess I shouldn't be expressing this level of deep love for a friend, that it wasn't okay. So I ended up taking that letter and putting it in a basket in my table and never giving it to Kana. And Ed, I actually saw Kana last week,
Did you?
and I was in LA seeing her. And there's this moment where we were leaving each other and we had an amazing weekend together. And I just wanted to sort of pour into her, like, this was amazing. Like, I feel so centered around you. I feel at so much peace around you, more than anyone else. And I just told her I loved her, but I hesitated to express the great extent through which I love her. She later posted an Instagram post about me where she identified me as her soulmate. And it was like easier, I think, for her to express it on Instagram, right? Instead of face to face. It was sort of easier for both of us to have some distance, because we have this sense, even me who study these things and understands how they're wrong, that if we feel too deeply for our friends, it's just not okay. And those are the emotions you should have for a spouse, not a friend.
And you talk about in the book different, I guess I wouldn't call them tactics or strategies, but sort of 6 different practices that we can utilize to enhance the friendships that we have. Maybe you could pick 1 or 2 of them right now and share them with us, because I still want people to read the book.
One of the big ones I share is initiative, because we assume friendship happens organically, that it should just sort of, drop into our lives. We shouldn't have to work at it, right? So different from our script that we have for romantic love. And in fact, this belief is related to being lonelier over time. The problem is we use the script from childhood, Ed, where in childhood, we had an infrastructure that provided continuous unplanned interaction and shared vulnerability. So we saw people every day and we had our guard down. Rebecca G. Adams, she's a sociologist who argues these are the ingredients for friendship to happen organically. As adults, we don't have that anymore, right? I mean, we have our workplaces, we see people every day. We're often not very vulnerable at work. So you can't rely on the same template you had when you were a kid now as an adult. Otherwise, according to the research, if you think it happens just based on luck, you're more likely to be lonely 5 years later.
Wow.
You guys, Amy is my doctor. Let's look at our overall medical healthcare system and how you feel about that, and where maybe some of the flaws and holes are in it, and where we should be moving in terms of treating people's health and wellness.
Yeah, excellent question or statement. So 20 years ago when we started this, and I mean, Dr. Bradley Bale and myself have the Bale-Doneen method, and we've worked together for about 20 years. And, when we wrote our first book, which was published in 2014, it was all about what we learned about protecting the brain from a stroke and the heart from a heart attack. And what we've learned since then is that the same information that we had been advocating for, learning about, and delivering in the clinical setting was the biggest value, Ed, is really about long-term health and wellness. And that is the avoidance of chronic disease like dementia, kidney disease, peripheral vascular disease, erectile dysfunction, vision. And so when you look at the current healthcare system, you think, well, that'll protect me from those. I mean, it must, right? But sadly, our current healthcare system, which hasn't changed in 20 years, which I'm embarrassed to say, but it's true, is still a sick care model, meaning if we have a problem, it picks us up after the fact. And if we have a heart attack, we'll get treated. If we have a stroke, we get treated. By the time we're older and we get something like dementia, well, it's considered sort of inevitable. And there's these diseases of aging that are somehow sadly accepted in this medical system, but they don't have to be. And that's really what this book, Healthy Heart, Healthy Brain, and I'm so grateful to you. I truly am for allowing me the honor to talk to your audience, because my dream is that those of us in our 50s, our 40s, our 30s really have the opportunity to realize there's things we can do right now to protect ourselves when we're 70, 80, 90. And we mustn't ever judge a book by its cover. You know, the idea that we may look healthy doesn't always mean our arteries are not inflamed. And so there are tools that are cost effective, reliable, good, strong data behind them to say we can have a different path.
Yeah, it's the most important thing to begin with, everybody, is that even in my case, when I tell people, hey, you know, I've had some issues with, you know, arterial sclerosis and circulatory and inflammation in my body. And they're like, no way. And, you know, I met Amy really, maybe it was, I guess, my late 30s, early 40s. And I wish I would have known these things in my 20s that I could have been doing to improve or prevent some of these things that happened with me that you basically, you know, in most of my case, and, you know, honestly, it's been sort of stopped. It's been stalled. In some cases, it's even been reversed. And so let's just dive in. There's so much. We're talking about gut health, brain health, you know, markers, all these other things. But well, first off, Amy, let's go something kind of interesting, because I just think it's sort of fascinating. Little things people wouldn't know, just because I think it's a fascinating way to start on red flags for heart attack or stroke that no one in the world knows about other than you, since you wrote this book. Now everybody can know. But like, what are some of these things that no one would even ever think matter, that could actually be telltale signs that you could have an issue now or in the future in your life?
Absolutely. So red flags are things that they don't have a cause and effect. And I think that's important to realize. So if you have a red flag and it's fixed, it doesn't mean the long-term risk is going to go away, nor do we have a clear understanding of why that red flag gives us risk down the line. So an example, there's some visual things like just looking at ourselves in the mirror. And we all have optimistic bias. So I encourage everyone to look in the mirror. And there's this interesting thing. It's called Frank sign, because the gentleman who published it was Dr. Frank, and it was in the 70s. And basically if you have a diagonal earlobe crease that literally is diagonal on the ear, and as we get older, it becomes more pronounced. It doesn't matter if you're male or female. It can be on one ear and not the other, or both. But if you have this diagonal earlobe crease, you have a 78% increased risk in your lifetime of having multivascular disease. And it's a great party trick, right? So I can't watch a television show or a news show. It happened to me the other day. I was watching something on baseball, and the one guy came off the field, and I'm like, oh my gosh, he has Frank's sign so significantly, and how am I going to tell him that he needs to get assessed? So Frank's sign is one.
Isn't that crazy, everybody? Think about what you just heard right now. We're 3 minutes into the freaking show.
The only reason I'm laughing about it, and not laughing in a weird way, but it's so obvious. And so when you have Frank's sign, then you think, well, what do I do about that? Or some others might be male pattern baldness, which men and women can have. So frontal parietal baldness, or baldness towards the cap of the head. Those all show increased risk. So do things like kidney stones, history of gallstones, migraine headaches. For women, and pregnancy is a stress test on the human body. So pregnancy opens this wonderful opportunity to give us clues on what we might have the opportunity to prevent down the line. So women that deal with things like preeclampsia during pregnancy, gestational diabetes, women as we move in through our life cycle of menopause and perimenopause, our good cholesterol starts to fall and our bad cholesterol starts to rise. And we have all these opportunities throughout our lifetime to say, hey, what about my health? And still, sadly, the healthcare system doesn't really pick us up throughout our life journey. So red flags are a wonderful tool to just say, wow, I think I better go get checked out. I mean, it's no one's fault if you have an earlobe crease. You didn't do that. You can't go stand on your head and eat cabbage for the rest of your life and make it go away. Nor can you have plastic surgery and say, well, now I don't have that, so it's better. No, it just says, I'm going to get checked out.
Thanks so much for having me.
And it was a difficult journey to get here, flying in.
I'm here.
And-
I'm happy. I got to use some of the mind-gut connection tools that we'll talk about.
Okay, let's get into these tools. So the first thing is, I was sort of surprised because I didn't realize this. You say that the gut has an impact on our mind and even as far as depression and mental health, mental well-being. I did not know that.
Absolutely. I mean, we always talk about mental health in the way of, thinking differently or taking medications, but there are bacteria in your gut that actually determine what you're thinking, your mood right now, your energy levels, even schizophrenia, neurological diseases, anxiety, depression. They can literally change your mood by just changing the bacteria in your body. It's crazy. You can transplant a mood from one person to the other.
We're going to talk about fecal transplant later because I didn't even know what the term meant until I prepared for the interview today. But let's stay there for a second. So you're telling me that, because by the way, people that are listening to this or watching this, oftentimes are having these emotions and these feelings that potentially they think are triggered by their environment, external environment.
Yeah.
Someone cut me off on the freeway, or I didn't get a promotion, or, I got a negative comment on social media. You're saying, maybe that's what it is, but it can actually be the bacteria in our gut that is actually signaling our emotions. How does that actually physically work?
There are at least four different ways we know that the gut actually signals to the brain what we should be feeling at any particular moment.
Okay.
It produces serotonin. It produces dopamine. I mean, these are the things that we think about are produced only in our brain, but actually 90% of it is produced in our gut. And what it does is it sends signals. They have ways to signal to the brain through the vagus nerve, through creating little vesicles that travel through the body, and like inflammation, so using our immune system to communicate. So when you're trying to think about, I'm anxious, or I'm not feeling well, I'm not focused, or I feel tired, one of the things you should do is start to think about how you could improve that gut bacteria, because there's a direct correlation. I mean, there's a bacteria called Akkermansia, and it actually has been shown to reverse neurological diseases because it produces this vitamin B3. Who knew that bacteria produce vitamins in our body, right?
Okay.
And this bacteria, this B3 nicotinamide, goes to our brain and actually can help with the myelin sheaths on our axons in our brain. So it's like protecting those sheaths is so important as we age with dementia and with things like ALS and autism and neurological diseases. So this stuff is like blowing open the entire world of how we think about our mindset and mood and even like how we do work, because we've been basically ignoring this data for so long. So we're on the track of killing these bacteria and stripping their functions. So basically we're working with a fraction of the bacteria we should be having.